In this lesson, we'll check our final mesh settings before we bring our models into KeyShot. Now, mesh settings are extremely important for just about every 3D rendering program. And the reason for that is nearly all 3D rendering programs take your data, whether it's Boolean data, solid data, and they're going to actually apply a mesh to it. So much the same way as when we've made meshes from our solid surfaces and we had to adjust the settings, that's exactly the same way that the rendering programs, and KeyShot's no different, are going to cut up your model. So for an example of this, let's kind of have a look in here. So this is the way that we see our grill model. And if I switch on the face bez, let me change that just so it's showing in black instead of this green color. So if we see our face bez here, it's all nice and clean, and there's not a lot of isocurves drawn through here, and it looks very nice, very good surfaces. If I switch that layer off and switch our face bez, which we've actually applied a mesh to, then this is how rendering programs see these surfaces. It cuts them all up into little triangles. And you may be able to see as I kind of move in that even though we've got some rounds and some nice filleted edges, that there's actually, at some point as you zoom in, you're going to get, the triangles don't bend. They're always flat triangles. So the more triangles you have, and maybe the edge here is a nicer example. There you go. The more triangles you have, the finer that mesh looks, so the nicer your renderings look. If these triangles were much larger, you'd actually see big facets going around this corner here. So by adjusting our mesh, we're really changing how the program sees our data for when it creates a rendering. And it doesn't matter that this part's already meshed. This will come in with that mesh into the program. Now, KeyShot currently uses your mesh settings from Rhino as the basis for its mesh settings when it imports a model. So if your mesh settings are really low and jagged, then your mesh or your model when it comes into KeyShot is going to be very low and jagged as well. And this is the same for how KeyShot handles SolidWorks files. As of the next version of KeyShot, KeyShot 5, it will display NURBS files natively, so we'll no longer have to worry about meshes. But if you're working in KeyShot version 4 or earlier, and 4 is the current version, then we still have to worry about meshes. And meshes are very easy to look at. We have looked at them a few times. So we'll just go into File, Properties, and that brings up our little window here. And we'll click on Mesh. And notice right now my model is set to smooth and slower. Yours may be on something different. If I go to Jagged and Faster and hit OK, it takes a moment to re-render or recreate the mesh for these. And let's see if we can kind of jump in here. Yeah, this is a good example. You can see the curves here are really faceted. So this is too low of a mesh to get a really high quality rendering. Now some parts look okay. You just get to other parts like right here and you get a bad sort of facet. If we were to render this thing from a great distance all the time, it would probably never matter. But anytime we would want to go in and do any sort of a close-up detail, then you'll really notice these. And I've seen this kill a lot of 3D renderings. It's just something your eye picks out because it's very unnatural in the real world to see that. So let me hit the spacebar again and we'll go back to our mesh settings. So smooth and slower is not bad, but I found a setting that I like to use for just about everything that works a little bit better, I think. So I'll click on Custom, and I never use this density slider. I always go into Detail Controls. And I've talked about this setting before. It's a good setting not only for working in Rhino if you want a good kind of a look to the parts you're working with, but it's a great setting to bring smaller consumer product type models. So anything smaller than, let's say, a fridge or a stove, something like that, down to maybe even jewelry size. It's a good setting. If you're going to go with jewelry, you want probably one little finer setting. I'll mention that as we make some adjustments here. So in Rhino 5 and Rhino 4 for that matter, we just make all of these 0, except for maximum distance edge to surface. I'll make that a 0.01, and minimum initial grid quads, I'll make that 16. And I've talked about it before, but we're telling Rhino is how to cut up our triangles or how small to make our triangles as they go around rounded surfaces like this. Now, as I said, this is a really good setting I've found for just about everything. I probably use this for 99.9% of everything I render. The only difference that I will do is occasionally, if I'm still seeing some facets on some parts, I may add another 0 to this part. If I do add another 0, it's only right at the very end, right before I bring it into KeyShot, because this does slow down everything you're doing in Rhino. Every time you create a part, it's got to re-render a mesh to show you a shaded view, and that mesh that it has to re-render or regenerate takes much longer to generate each time. So I recommend only using that extra 0 if you really, really need to. And if when you get in KeyShot or whatever render program, if you find that your renderings are really having some difficulties, you may find that you've kind of overshot by adding that extra 0 in there. And if you try bringing it back to this setting and try re-rendering it in your render program, you may find that it works perfect. So anyway, that's kind of my setting that I like to use to really become my default setting for my renderings that I do in KeyShot. I'll hit OK. That'll take a few moments to generate a new mesh, and notice right away those facets all disappear and it gets much nicer. And then I usually just do a zoom extents all, so I'll right click on this icon, because sometimes when I do this, if I move the cursor you'll see it respin, there we go. Sometimes it only creates the mesh that it needs for that particular view. So by doing a zoom extents all, I force my viewport, in fact I force all 4 viewports to zoom all the way out, and then they'll regenerate whatever mesh they need based on your new settings. So that finishes our look and discussion of Rhino render mesh settings, and in the next lesson, we'll look at importing the model into KeyShot.